Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Sex, Suffrage, and Scandalous Ladies. The topic of this episode is centered around the themes of the temperance movement in the mid to late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. We often learn about the temperance movement as boring women who wanted to ban fun and drinking. But in reality, it is much more complicated than that. It was about women, and most often wives and mothers, who were desperate for a solution to the violence and financial insecurity of their husbands. Without the knowledge to realize most violence in families is due to power imbalances, these women blamed what they thought was the main factor, alcohol, which certainly does not help familial issues. Temperance supporters thought banning alcohol would make men come home at night, allocate money to other family needs, and reduce battering against wives. It is a movement that may have been misguided in a sense, as perhaps it should have tackled power issues, but the women of the period did what they could. The movement had a fervent and passionate supporters, and no one can deny the women's mobilization for a cause that rang true in their hearts. I will be talking about two women in this episode in relation to the overall movement. First, Carrie Nation and her saloon smashers, and then later I will discuss Victoria Woodhall, a free lover and spiritualist. My dear friend Katie Agan will be joining me for a discussion about Victoria Woodhall and all her multitudes. Katie identifies as herself as pansexual, and Woodhall's themes of free love can be related to today's ideas of sexual liberation. To start with Carrie Nation, she was born in Kentucky on November 25th, 1846. She eventually married Charles Gloyd and had one daughter with him. Unfortunately, Charles was a severe alcoholic, and his addiction cost him his life and left Carrie Nation alone with a small child. It could be argued her first marriage really ignited her into the temperance movement. In 1874, she remarried David Nation, a preacher and a lawyer, and they settled in Kansas. In 1880, Kansas became the first state to adopt the ban on the manufacture and distribution of alcohol. But as most of us could have guessed, this law was not greatly followed. Many saloons and stores still served and sold alcohol. When she was in Kansas, Carrie Nation started her own local branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. She was also a supporter of women's suffrage and women's rights overall. It is reported that at first her temperance protests were simple. She could be seen singing hymns outside of saloons or verbally accosting patrons. On June 5th, 1889, however, she received a divine message from God that instructed her to take up the notch a little bit. She took her revelation very seriously, and on June 7th, she took several rocks and started to smash a saloon. It is said that she attacked 6 bars in Kiowa, Kansas in June 1900. In 1901, she began to carry a hatchet around and would use it at the crates, barrels, and bottles of alcohol. She would use it against the bar itself. It was also reported that she would sometimes use bricks. The hatchet, however, is a tool closely related to her, and in many silent film depictions and cartoons, she is shown with a hatchet. In January 1901, she traveled to Topeka, Kansas, the capital of Kansas. When she got off the train, many claimed she wore a popular outfit for the times, especially for women involved in the temperance movement. She wore a full-length black dress, black cotton stockings, square-toe shoes, a shawl, and a black poke bonnet. Around her neck was also a white bow, which was very common among women advocating for temperance. While in Topeka, she attacked several bars and saloons that many capital legislators frequented. She met with the governor at the time, William Stanley, and pleaded that the state laws be enforced. He is quoted as saying, "You are a woman, but a woman must know a woman's place. They can't come in here and raise this kind of disturbance." In December 1901, she attacked the Hotel Carrie in Wichita, Kansas, which garnered a lot of publicity and attention. It caused several $1,000s worth of damage and landed her in jail. In 1902, she also began publishing Smasher's Mail. It was a magazine that her supporters and others in disfavor of alcohol consumption could read. It mostly consisted of reprinted letters that precisely described her saloon attacks. In 1905, she went to Oklahoma and began publishing The Hatchet to advocate for support of temperance in the then territory. In 1907, she moved to Washington, D.C. to lobby for temperance and make public appearances advocating for the issue. She became popular in the lecture circuit and developed a national reputation. To support herself, she participated in lectures, but she also sold photographs, hatchet pins, and home defender buttons, as she and her supporters called themselves that. It can be interpreted that they believed they were preserving and protecting the home by trying to rid alcohol and encourage men to spend more time at home with their families. It is reported that she was arrested over 30 times between 1900 and 1910. She was not only arrested, but imprisoned, whipped, clubbed, and even shot at. Carrie Nation traveled far and wide for her message, landing her in all places like Texas and Nova Scotia. She later adopted the name Carrie Nation for its implied meaning that she was carrying the country to a better and moral high ground without alcohol. David Nation eventually divorced her in 1901 after 24 years of marriage on grounds of desertion, assuming it was probably due to her frequent trips to various places to smash several saloons. They had no children together, and she continued to bear his last name. Perhaps he was not pleased with her using his name for her message, but it is quite clever nonetheless. Carrie Nation eventually moved to Eureka Springs, Arkansas. There she established Hatchet Hall. The house acted as her residence and as a home for homeless women who were displaced due to their husbands' drinking. She collapsed giving a speech in Eureka Springs and passed away at 64 in June 1911. She never lived to see the federal Prohibition Amendment. Carrie Nation was buried in an unmarked grave in Missouri. The Women's Christian Temperance Movement later erected a stone that read, "Faithful to the cause of prohibition, she hath done what she could." Okay, so to talk about this next activist that I want to talk about, I'm joined by my friend Katie again. We have a bit of a peanut gallery, Mackenzie and Madison.
Hi.
But Katie and I have grown up together, and I was thinking about it, and we met when we were 12 in 7th grade, so it's probably, 10 years?
Actually, it might have been 6th grade, because didn't we do, the all-city choir?
Oh, we did, yeah. Yep, so that's crazy, but she is passionate about her love for cats, math, and you are a queer woman in the 21st century, so you bring, an interesting perspective to this woman. Victoria Woodhall was a supporter of free love, and she tried to run for president before women even had the right to vote. And overall, I thought you could just add to this conversation and make it an episode for more casual listening. And we're Leos, so we love to talk, rant, and rave, so it might get a bit chaotic in here. So Victoria Woodhall was a suffragist, a spiritualist, a free lover, a Marxist revolutionary, a financial, and a candidate for the U.S. presidency. So, jack of all trades.
Mm-hmm.
She really just did it all.
What didn't she do?
She was born in Ohio in 1883 and was one of 10 children. And during her childhood, her family traveled to the Midwest as spiritualists, and they sold, these medical elixirs, which were probably just, bullshit, they didn't do anything. And they worked as magnetic healers, so definitely cool. A crystal girl.
Yeah. Relatable.
As young as 15 or 16, she married this man, Dr. Cannon Woodhall, who was reportedly 28 at the time. So that's a 12-ish year age difference, which is a red flag. So by today's standards, you could say she was marrying a fully developed man when she was still a child, which is kind of weird. But nonetheless, she had 2 children with him, Brian, who was mentally handicapped, and a daughter, Zulu Maud. Her husband was an alcoholic, and she had to support the nuclear family by doing odd jobs. So she worked as an actress and a seamstress, and she also did spiritual readings on different people. And this overall episode that I'm doing it on is on the Temperance Movement, which a lot of the women in the Temperance Movement wanted to prohibit alcohol because they thought that alcohol led men to be domestically violent towards them, and they would come home and verbally abuse or physically assault them. But Victoria Woodhall took an interesting approach because she, as we know now, alcohol is not
the root of the problem of domestic violence.
Yeah,
it's power and it's control. So these women were trying to do something by saying, like, we should cut out alcohol and, like, that would solve problems, but we know that that really, like, didn't do anything, which is why I wanted to include Victoria Woodhall, like, talking about the temperance movement, because she probably did support that, but she, instead of using alcohol as the root of her activism, she kind of, like, advocated for free love and, like, the abolition of marriage and trying to attack, like, power and control. So free lovers, they did not advocate for polyamory or, like, open marriages, but for the ability to enter and leave relationships without stigma. They also believe that the state should have not any intrusion on love and romantic decisions, including state-sanctioned marriage. The movement supported the abolition of marriage, a woman's choice to have sex and reproduce, and an honest public discussion of sex. Supporters argued that it was the secrecy surrounding sex and sexuality that damaged society rather than the acts themselves.
Yeah.
So my first kind of question is, like, do you think people are still hesitant to talk openly about sex? Like, we are more honest today than we definitely were in, like, the 19th century. But, I mean, between, like, music and media, people are used to hearing about sex. But, like, in everyday interpersonal relationships, do you think people are still hesitant or uncomfortable to talk about sex?
I think, yeah, like, I know that people are still, like, I mean, in terms of, like, queer relationships, like, yeah, for sure, like, people are still, like, uncomfortable, like, I feel like people are still hesitant to, like, openly talk about that kind of stuff, and I, like, understandably so, because it's, like, yeah, we're obviously a lot better than we were, but, like, we're obviously not all the way there yet still, like, there's still a lot of issues with that. People are still homophobic, people are still transphobic, like, that's still obviously a big problem. I do think that we've, like, it is better than, well, obviously, better than it was in the 1800s, but, like, it's just, I feel like, with, like, TikTok and stuff, in, like, social media, like, people are more, like, we'll talk about whatever, and, like, that's, like, I think it's a great thing, because we're bringing more attention, especially, like, sexual education. Like, the stuff that people, like, learn on TikTok that, like, they just were not taught in school.
Right.
And even, like, bringing in, like, the ban in Florida to, like, you can't say gay. Like, are you, like, what? Oh, my God. So, it's definitely, yeah, it's better, but it's still, there's still issues talking about it. It's not totally where it could be.
Yeah. And I think, like, with her idea of, like, you should talk about just sex more openly and, like, kind of have, like, this free love mentality, because, like, you're pansexual, but, like, it's hard to, like, find a community of people, like, around you that, like, are also identify as that, and, like, the internet, I feel like, can definitely give that sense of community before, I think, sometimes, like, real-life relationships can.
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't have known what pansexuality was if it wasn't for the internet. Like, I learned what it was on Tumblr, and I was like, oh, yeah, like, that's me, like, that makes sense. But whenever I tell people that I'm pansexual, they're like, what is that? Like, 98% of the time, they're like, what is that? And I'm like, oh, it's just, like, I just don't care about gender, like, that's not a factor. Like, and they still can be confused about that, and I'm like, well, that's just what it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, aside from, like, the free love, she also argued that, like, marital sex was, like, naturally coercive because women depended on men for financial needs. So it was, like, they had to perform, like, sexual acts or romantic acts for them or to bear their children because that was just the way it was, and they had to be financially supported by them. And they were, on top of that, seen as the men's property and were always expected to succumb to the man's sexual pleasure because marriage was, like, crucial to, like, societal and religious order at the time.
Yeah.
And I know you looked this quote up, but she was quoted saying, "Yes, I am a free lover. I have an inalienable, constitutional, and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long and short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please, and with that right, neither you nor any law you can frame has any right to interfere. And I have the further right to demand an unrestricted exercise of that right. And it is your duty, and not only to accord it, but as a community to see that I am protected in it. I trust that I am fully understood, for I mean just that, and nothing less." Which is just, like, bars. Like,
I know. I love that, yeah.
So then, like, how do you define your sexuality, and do you think, like, she would have been a supporter of the LGBTQ movement, because it never really says anything explicitly, like, they, you know, but, like,
yeah.
But it, like, kind of coincides with, like, sexual liberation. And, like,
oh, yeah. Like, just reading her quotes, I'm like, yeah, like, that is just what it's all about. Especially, like, being pansexual. Like, it's just, like, basically being, like, I love whoever I want. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's the whole thing. Is that, like, I didn't, like, with being pansexual, like, it was just, like, I didn't want to have any restriction at all. That was the whole point. Yeah. It's, like, that's why I was, like, oh, that's me. Like, it's just, like...
No boundaries, like,
exactly.
no
like, if I see somebody I'm attracted to them. It doesn't matter, like, who they are at all. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter what they identify as at all. Like, it's just, like, duh. Like, that just makes so much sense to me that I'm, like, I don't understand how, like, people don't get it. Yeah. That's just... It's, like, reading those quotes, I was like, wow, exactly. Like, just love whoever you want. Like, it shouldn't be restricted by anything.
Yeah. And she thought that sexual information should be, like, a topic of conversation at the breakfast and dinner table, or, like, at least until everyone, like, understood. And female enjoyment of intercourse was also key in the free love movement. I think especially now, like, you know, there's always jokes like, oh, men don't know anything about the clitoris. And, like, I don't know if you guys have seen those TikToks lately of, like, this woman will be, like, walking on the street and she'll have, like, a picture of a female anatomy and she'll walk up to men and be like, can you identify where the clitoris is? And none of them get it right. And I think, like, that just, again, like, we've come so far, but we also have, like, so much farther to go. Yeah. And, like, she didn't go into necessarily, like, detail in her speeches about, like, oh, you have to be, like, she wasn't, like, vulgar, but they were also, like, direct about her goals. And a cartoonist, Thomas Nast, depicted her as Mrs. Satan because she was thought to lure men's wives toward the free love movement. So, like, the public didn't really
I can
like
see
her.
Why. Yeah, because that's just how society was. Like, you could just, like, you owned your wife. Like,
yeah.
Ew, like, stuff, like, horrible, but that's, yeah.
And she exemplified the sexualization of public women, which was, like, quite different from the view of suffragists who were viewed as sexually undesirable. Like, I learned a lot in my research and, like, the class I've taken that suffragists were basically just told, like, oh, you're doing this because you can't find a husband. Yeah. Like, you want the right to vote because you're ugly and you're a spinster and, like, you'll never get married. Yeah. And so that's just why you want the right to vote. And that's, like... When I wrote here, I was like, which I feel like can often be a theme in feminist movements because women often have, like, thoughtful critiques about something, like, about the inequity. In this case, like, pleasure in the bedroom or free love to, like, kind of move freely in your relationships and not feel like a man's property. But, like, that is then turned into, like, oh, you're Mrs. Satan. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can't get any, like, blah, blah, blah. Like, no.
Yeah. So then moving on from her free love movement, she worked as a clairvoyant, which is, like, having the ability to predict future events. And she eventually divorced her first husband, because, remember, he was an alcoholic who, like, did not treat her well. And she became in this relationship with this colonel from the Civil War. He was, like, a veteran, and he also worked as a spiritualist. And they never got officially married, but they referred to each other as husband and wife, kind of showing that, like, you can be committed to someone without having to, like, put it into those terms. So in 1968, Woodhall and her husband and the Claflins, her, like, original family, that's her maiden name, they moved to New York City, and once they arrived, Victoria's father introduced her to Cornelius Vanderbilt. So obviously those people had a lot of money. And he had requested a spiritual reading to connect with his deceased mother and son. So yeah, she knew people up there. So she was, like, getting around. So Woodhall, Blood, and her sister Tennessee, in some research she's referred to as Tenny, which I think is just, like, a cute nickname. And they started a stock brokerage with the help of the Vanderbilts, and it was called Woodhull, Claflin and Company, and created a sensation in the press. They were referred to as bewitching brokers and fascinating financiers, and it was reported that Woodhull's sister most likely had a sexual relationship with Cornelius Vanderbilt, which is, like, a little bit scandalous, but...
Go on.
And the sisters were the first and only female stockbrokers to work on Wall Street in the 19th century, which is just, like, go off. And the sister Tenny is reported saying in the New York Courier, no women had ever been stock or gold brokers. Wall Street was taboo to petticoats. But we did not intend to let our petticoats interfere with anybody or take up any more room in the street than the other brokers' trousers. So,
That's so
again.
cool.
So opening the brokerage, though, was more so about trying to get publicity for the various social issues they supported. The same year, they started a weekly newsletter titled Woodhall and Claflin's Weekly, where they advocated for social reform, and she publicly decided to run for president in that, newsletter. And in addition, in a speech, she exposed a popular reverend for having an affair with one of his married parishioners. In her weekly newsletter.
Spilling the tea.
Yeah.
Love it.
She wanted to expose hypocrisy in sexual activity. She made it clear that she did not disapprove of the affair, but that he practiced the free love in private, but then denounced it in public.
Yeah, and that's, I feel like a lot of men were doing it at that time.
Yeah.
Like, cheating on their wives. Like, yeah, they do it now, too. Like,
She was also charged with sharing obscene material and was imprisoned, but later acquitted. But many free lovers, including Woodhall, were tried under the infamous Comstock laws for their writing speeches and ideas, which basically defied, like, obscenity in broad terms, and it was illegal to distribute any of that material through the U.S. postal system. So even Margaret Sanger, like the modern mother of Planned Parenthood, was even, like, tried under those laws for trying to, like, give women information about birth control and family planning. And those, like, laws lasted for, like, a while. I don't remember the exact date, but it was crazy. But it is noted that over 200 women have tried to run for president with varying degrees of success. So that's a really large number to me. And when I read that, I was honestly surprised. Yeah, I was like, so, like, growing up, do you remember hearing about any women, like, running for president besides Hillary Clinton? Because I only learned in college that Shirley Crimson, a black woman, announced her candidacy for president in 1972. But do you think if we knew, like, that this many women have tried to run for president, that it would seem, like, more feasible for, like, for us to...
I don't know why they don't tell us that.
like, obviously they did not win, but, like, they were trying, and it's like, well, if we just keep trying, eventually, like...
Or even, like, maybe they didn't make it to, like, that far, but even them just, like, putting in that I want to run and, like, declaring
I'm doing it. Like, I'm doing it. Like, come on. It would have been good to know.
Yeah. And one of her, like, descendants is quoted saying, "This was an era where a woman could not vote, could not enter a restaurant, a store, an establishment of any kind unless she was escorted by a man. It was controversial for a woman to do anything, but she had the foresight not to accept the way society was." Which is just awesome. And her platform was based on women's suffrage, free love, a nonprofit commerce system, and land for all, which, like, I'd vote for her.
Like, everything. Oh my God, I wish she was here now.
Yeah. And she didn't even meet the mandated age of 35 to run for office, and it's reported that her campaign was, like, never taken seriously after she exposed, like, that famous preacher. And she was nominated by the Equal Rights Party, but ultimately the president that ended up winning that term was, like, Ulysses S. Grant. So, but Victoria is reported saying, "I am quite well aware that in assuming this position, I shall evoke more ridicule than enthusiasm at the outset. But this is an epic of sudden changes and startling surprises. Whom may appear absurd today will assume a serious aspect tomorrow."
Yeah.
Because, like, even though then they thought she was crazy, like, here we are sitting here, like, saying, like, go off, like, that would have been so cool, like, like, she gets her credit now, I feel like.
Yeah, and, like, even, like, her, like, what she was, like, her platform, like, we need that right now, like, we still, like, land for all, like, free, like, everything, all of it, like, the world still needs that.
Yeah.
It's kind of sad.
So from being a free lover, a female presidential candidate, and publisher of Hot Secrets, she was not the most loved by the public, but she often used this, like, notoriety to, like, reach her audiences further and, like, share her messages, like, to try to get their attention. She was kind of rejected from the suffrage movement, as they saw her as, like, kind of an embarrassment, because a lot of times they were, like, rich, like, proper white ladies, like, trying to do stuff. But she was also the president of the American Association of Spiritualists from 1871 to 1875. And overall, she just has, like, such a complicated history, and she is often only described in, like, one of two ways. Like, The first is that she's a reformer that tried to run for president and a woman activist, like, etc., like free love, like praising her. And then other people kind of describe her as like a woman from a family of huskers and clairvoyant and whore and like rejected from movements. So like, do you notice that women are often described in one of two categories, like virgin or whore, good or bad?
Yeah.
And like when we tell stories about women, like it's almost as if we cannot respect and admire the dualities and like complexities of their lives and their personalities,
Yeah,
which I think is frustrating.
Yeah, it's like black and white thinking, like
Yeah.
that cognitive distortion that like it's one way or the other, like it's this or that, and it's like nobody is like, well, like you can't generalize anybody to just one or the other. Like everything's gray.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like even like to connect it back to like modern people, I feel like Miley Cyrus is often like depicted in that
so
way.
Many people
Like
yeah.
You're either a whore because you did like the We Can't Stop video and you'll never redeem yourself from that.
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
now, you know, she sings like Heart of Glass and all those like old people that criticize her and are like, oh, we love that song. Like, she did such a good job. Like, you can't like, yeah, all these women
love
just like
to villainize women.
Yeah. And it's crazy. And someone said, it's curious to us that even in this day and age, we're still really resistant to telling certain people's stories. Caroline Rue, a filmmaker working on a documentary about Woodhall, tells this platform, it's fine for us to talk about the Betsy Rosses, but if there's any blemish on a woman, we just won't talk about her.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is one of the reasons why like we don't
it's
hear about her.
Yeah, and it's so much like with men, it's like all like for example, just like men and like especially in like politics, like we find out they do all this messed up stuff and it just gets swept under the rug all the time. But if it was a woman, it'd be like, yep, she's the worst. She's Satan.
Mm-hmm.
Like she is just.
And that's even how like Hillary Clinton is depicted. Like
yeah.
when I read like
she's
that,
the worst.
That
like,
Mrs. Satan,
yeah.
like that she was called that. Like I definitely remember like Hillary Clinton being shown with like horns and everything like that.
Yeah. It's terrible.
So Victoria Woodhall eventually left her relationship with, like, that veteran. In 1876, Woodhall and Claflin's Weekly was forced to fold and nearly broke. The sisters moved to England, marrying into wealthy families, and reinventing themselves as, like, aristocrats and, like, patrons to the arts. She returned to the U.S. in 1892 to announce that she was going to run for president again and lead the women's movement, but it, like, did not receive a powerful response at all. So she eventually returned to England and was widowed in 1897. Once there, she sponsored the village kindergarten, founded various women's clubs, and helped fundraise for World War I. And she eventually passed away on June 10th, 1927. So she eventually did get to see, like, the suffrage amendment get passed and all of that. But overall, do you have any final closing thoughts? Or do you think, like, obviously, I think I know your answer, but like, do you think we should be taught more about women like Victoria Woodhall? And it reminds me of like women who are doing groundbreaking things, even though the common narrative is that women were cast in the shadows.
Yeah, definitely would have loved to learn about her, especially like growing up, like the idea, even just the idea of like the free love movement. Like I would have been like, oh, like. Wow, because I like questioned my sexuality for a long time, especially like in elementary school, and even if they just talked about her for like a second, even just said like a paragraph about her, like and her beliefs with that, I would have been like, oh, something would have clicked. I feel like in my brain, and just like we learned so much about like for example, in elementary school, I had to do a project on Henry Hudson and like Christopher Columbus. We all had to do it, and it's like, why are we talking about these shitty men? Like these people, these people that have done like horrible things. Like when we could be talking about people that were actually like revolutionary, like not just in the sense that they colonized a country that already had people living in it. Like,
yeah, and I feel like the duality of her life too, like, and especially with like the free love, like. Even if she wasn't talking about sexuality, like, you'd certainly apply it to that, but, like, the notion that, like, you don't have to, you know, marry a husband and have two kids and a dog and a white picket fence. Like, you can kind of do all this stuff, and she was kind of revolutionary, like, before anyone was ready to hear it, which I think is sad because she was never taken seriously by a lot of people. But...
And even now, like, it just, like, growing up, I never was, like, the type of person that, like, knew I wanted to have a family, and I just, like... always thought I was kind of weird for that. Like, I never pictured being married in my, like, ever. Like, I just haven't never had that idea in my head. And, like, that's normal. That's okay. Like, it doesn't have to be, you get married and that's it. Like, I love that. She just didn't believe that.
Yeah. She was definitely before her time. She was
So
born in the wrong
before her time.
generation.
Holy crap. Like,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. She's amazing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking about it with me.
Of
And
course.
everybody for listening. And yeah, that's Victoria Woodhall.
She was